All right, let's take a look at section 4. Here's the focus question. Capitalism advanced most quickly and dramatically in the trans-Mississippi West, whose lands now became absorbed by white settlement and whose resources became available for exploitation. In 1893, the historian Frederick Jackson Turner delivered a lecture, The Significance of the Frontier in American History, in which he argued that the frontier had forged American culture's distinctive qualities: individual freedom, political democracy, and economic mobility. Turner argued that the frontier had been a safety valve which drew away the disaffected in the East and therefore mitigated social unrest. Turner, very influential at the time, drew on long-standing notions that the West offered economic opportunity and freedom to newcomers. Many farmers, gold rush miners, and immigrants did find economic opportunity in the West, but there the accuracy of Turner's interpretation ended. Migrants to the West moved in groups, usually families, not as individuals. The West was not an empty space, but rather was inhabited by Native Americans who had been dispossessed by whites for the frontier to be settled. And the West was not a paradise of small farms, but an area with industrial mining and agriculture, landlords, railroads, Mexican and Chinese contract laborers, and, until the end of the Civil War, enslaved African Americans. The West was also not a single area, but rather was incredibly diverse, ranging from the Great Plains to the Rocky Mountains, the desert Southwest, the Sierra Nevada, and the verdant coasts and valleys of California and the Pacific Northwest. The political and economic incorporation of the American West was part of a global process. In many parts of the world, indigenous inhabitants were removed, often with fierce resistance. The West's incorporation into the United States required the federal government's intervention. The government acquired Indian land by purchase or force, regulated territories, and gave land and money to farmers, railroads, and mining companies. In the 20th century, the construction of federally financed irrigation systems and dams opened the West to commercial farming. Despite the myth of the West's rugged individualism, the area became part of the nation only by massive government activity. More land came into cultivation in the 30 years after the Civil War than in the previous 2.5 centuries of American history. Settlers acquired farmlands from the Homestead Act, and more bought land from speculators and railroad companies that had been given public lands by the federal government. A vast agricultural belt growing wheat and corn for national and international markets emerged in the middle border: Minnesota, the Dakotas, Nebraska, and Kansas, with a diverse population of farmers who migrated from the East, South, and Europe. Farming in this region was difficult, and much of the burden fell on women, who faced severe isolation. The middle border's arid land required irrigation and thus made family farming difficult, but despite the emergence of a few large bonanza farms with thousands of acres and many agricultural wage workers, family farms prevailed. These farms increasingly grew for national and international markets and specialized in one crop. Railroads brought factory goods to rural farmers who became more dependent on banks for loans, machineries, and products and subject to the ups and downs of international agricultural prices. American farms thus became part of a world market in which farmers across the globe faced ongoing crises as competition increased and prices declined. Western farming's future was bound up with agricultural enterprises using irrigation, chemicals, and machines, all of which required capital investments beyond the means of most family farmers. Although a few bonanza farms covering thousands of acres appeared, family farms still dominated the trans-Mississippi West. Small farmers became more connected to national and international markets, and some specialized in single crops for sale at distant markets. Farm families became increasingly dependent upon manufactured goods from urban areas and loans to purchase land. Agriculture demonstrated that the international economy was becoming more integrated. Market activity in Argentina, for example, began affecting farmers' lives in the United States. Small farmers across the globe experienced hardship, and many joined the migration to cities. The future of agriculture ultimately lay with giant agricultural enterprises. The future was on display in California, where huge fruit and vegetable farms owned by large corporations were worked by migrant workers from China, the Philippines, Japan, and Mexico who never expected to own land themselves. The decades after the Civil War also saw the golden age of cattle ranching and cowboys. Railroad stations at Abilene, Dodge City, and Wichita, Kansas became destinations for the now legendary cattle drives from Texas. The cowboys who worked the drives, a diverse group of white, Mexican, and black men, became icons of freedom and were immortalized in fiction and film. But their life was far from romantic. They were mostly low-paid wage workers, and the long-distance cattle drives ended by the 1880s when farmers fenced in lands with barbed wire and severe winters killed millions of cattle. The cattle industry that reappeared was dominated by large ranches close to railroads. The West was also urban, with large cities such as San Francisco and the growth of other cities like Los Angeles due to tourism and oil. By 1890, a higher percentage of its population lived in cities than was the case in other regions. Large corporate enterprises dominated the West, and particularly in industries such as lumber and mining and as sheep farming in New Mexico, independent owners and operators gave way to large corporate firms. Additionally, the lumber industry decimated coastal forests, and mining encouraged the sudden rise and fall of western towns. Chinese immigration, which began at the time of the California Gold Rush, continued into the post war years. Prior to the Civil War, most immigrants had been single men, but by 1870, entire families began to immigrate. By 1880, 105,000 persons of Chinese descent lived in the United States, and three-quarters of those lived in California. Many immigrants worked on railroads and in mines. The growing presence of Chinese immigrants sparked an outpouring of anti-Chinese sentiment, leading to exclusionary immigration laws. In the 1840s, the Mormons moved to the Salt Lake area of the U.S. territory, now the capital of modern-day Utah. In 1857, after reports that the Utah Territory's appointed governor, the Mormon leader Brigham Young, was interfering with federal judges in the area, President James Buchanan removed Young and appointed a non-Mormon as governor. Young refused to comply, and federal troops were sent to occupy the territory and remained until the beginning of the Civil War. Conflict between Mormons and non-Mormons continued in the region, and during this period, the Mountain Meadow Massacre occurred, in which a group of Mormons attacked a group of non-Mormons traveling by wagon to settle in California. All adults and older children were killed, over 100 persons, with only a few small children surviving. More than 2 decades later, one of the leaders of the raid was tried and sentenced for murder. Over the next few decades, tensions continued as Mormon communities moved to other areas of the American West, but much of the conflicts were similar to those with non-Mormon U.S. settlers to the region. For example, Mormons saw the freewheeling lifestyles of cowboys as the embodiment of immorality. In the 1880s, the Mormon leaders sought to keep from further antagonizing the U.S. government by banning polygamy and wrote the ban into Utah state constitution upon gaining statehood in 1896. The West's incorporation into the American economy sealed the doom of the Plains Indians and their world. Their lives had already been changed by the introduction of the horse, which enabled tribes such as the Cheyenne, Comanche, Crow, Kiowa, and Sioux to move onto the plains to hunt buffalo. Incessant warfare resulted between newcomers and existing tribes. Most whites moving to the Pacific coast experienced little hostility from the Plains Indians, but the settlement of lands there, beginning in the 1850s, brought bloody conflict. President Grant's 1869 peace policy ended the long-standing practice of making treaties with Indian nations, replacing the treaties with decisions made only by Congress and the President. Indian nations rightfully understood this as a violation of their sovereignty, and warfare soon resumed. Civil War generals like Philip Sheridan attacked the basis of the Indian economy, destroying villages, horses, and the buffalo to end Indian resistance. By the 1880s, army campaigns and buffalo hunters had nearly eradicated the buffalo in the West. The army subjugated one tribe after another. In 1877, U.S. troops under O.O. Howard, the former commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau, forced the Nez Perce to surrender and relocate from Oregon to an Oklahoma reservation. 2 years later, Chief Joseph, that tribe's leader, delivered a speech in Washington to President Rutherford B. Hayes and other notables that protested the reservation policy and used the language of freedom strengthened by the Civil War and Reconstruction. He said, and I quote, "Let me be a free man, free to travel, free to stop, free to work, free to trade where I choose, free to choose my own teachers, free to follow the religion of my fathers, free to think and talk and act for myself," end quote. Indians sometimes inflicted great costs on American forces, most notably in 1876 at Little Bighorn, where Sioux and Cheyenne warriors led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse killed George Custer and 250 of his men. In the Southwest, the Apache leaders Cochise and Geronimo attacked white settlers and resisted army units well into the 1880s when they surrendered. The Comanche, who had dominated other Indians in New Mexico and Colorado, also fell to American power in the 1870s. Indians' idea of freedom, resting on preserving their cultural and political autonomy and control of ancestral lands, clashed with the values and interests of most white Americans. Nearly all believed that the federal government should persuade or force the Plains Indians to give up their land, religion, communal property, nomadic way of life, and gender relations, and adopt Christianity, private property, and small farming on reservations, where men would work the fields and women would work in the home. In 1871, Congress ended the treating system in which the government had negotiated agreements whereby Indian tribes were regarded as independent nations. The Bureau of Indian Affairs established boarding schools where Indian children removed from their parents and tribes were given new names and educated in white ways. In 1887, passage of the Dawes Act fragmented the lands of nearly all tribes into small parcels to be given to Indian families, with the rest of the land to be sold to white buyers. Indians who accepted the farms and adopted the habits of civilized life would be offered American citizenship. Though the policy led to the loss of much tribal land and the erosion of Indian cultural traditions, whites benefited enormously, taking much of the best Indian lands, including much of Oklahoma. In the 50 years after the Dawes Act's passage, Indians lost 86 million of the 138 million acres they had possessed in 1887. Overall, according to one estimate, the United States has acquired over 1.5 billion acres of land from Native Americans. Many laws and treaties in the 19th century offered Indians the right to become American citizens if they left the tribal setting and assimilated into American society. But tribal identity was one thing nearly every Indian wished to maintain, and very few took advantage of these offers. Thus, few Native Americans were recognized as American citizens. Western courts ruled that the rights guaranteed in the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th and 15th Amendments did not apply to them. In one of its most controversial rulings, Elk versus Wilkins from 1884, the Supreme Court agreed. It questioned whether any Indian had achieved the degree of civilization required of American citizens. By 1900, roughly 53,000 Indians had become American citizens by accepting land allotments under the Dawes Act. Finally, in 1924, Congress extended citizenship to all Native Americans, but their right to cast ballots remained contested. As late as 1948, Arizona and New Mexico did not allow Indians to vote. In the late 1880s, some Indians practiced the ghost dance, a religious movement to revitalize Indian life. Ghost dance leaders predicted that one day whites would disappear, the buffalo would return, and Indians would resume their cultural practices, free from the ills introduced by whites. On December 29, 1890, large numbers of Indians gathered for singing, dancing, and religious ceremonies. When the government, fearing a revolt, sent troops to the reservation, soldiers opened fire on ghost dancers at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota, killing as many as 200 Indians, mostly women and children. It was viewed as a success by the press, and many soldiers involved later won the Medal of Honor. The massacre at Wounded Knee ended 4 centuries of armed conflict between Native Americans and European settlers and their descendants. By 1900, the Indian population had reached a low point of 250,000. But Indians survived, and their numbers grew in the 20th century. The conquest of the West was part of a worldwide phenomenon in which settlers moved into the interior of regions in temperate climates all over the globe, bringing familiar crops and livestock and starting mining and other industries. Argentina, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United States are thus called settler societies because immigrants from overseas rapidly outnumbered and displaced original inhabitants, unlike in India and much of colonial Africa, where only a few Europeans managed to dominate entire societies. Some settler societies, including those in Canada and Australia, removed indigenous people from their lands and attempted to replace their traditional cultural practices. In 2008, forced removal of Aboriginal children in Australia led to a National Day of Apology. The West has played many roles in America's national self-consciousness. It has been imagined as a place of individual freedom and endless opportunity, but also as a lawless place ruled by cowboys and Indians. This Wild West was marked by gunfights, cattle drives, and stagecoach robberies. This image was later solidified by Hollywood movies, but was first disseminated in vaudeville shows in the late 19th century. An important figure in the creation of the Wild West was William Buffalo Bill Cody, who developed an elaborate theatrical production that toured the US and Europe for decades. The Wild West show had battle reenactments, including Little Bighorn, Indian rituals, and sharpshooting demonstrations, including Annie Oakley. In addition to shows, the image of the Wild West circulated in popular novels and sensational journal accounts. Overall, the Wild West of the American imagination did not account for the industrial development and diversity of the region's population. So, that's the end of section 4. We'll be back with you.